Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Northern Pacific Railway History Channel. And this is the second installment of our transcontinental cross-country trip from New York City out to Seattle, Washington by train. The day before yesterday, we boarded the New York Central train in New York's Grand Central Station, Manhattan Island, and from there we went out on an overnight trip to Chicago. In Chicago yesterday at 11:30 a.m. we boarded the Northern Pacific's best passenger train, the North Coast Limited. And from there we went up to the Twin Cities, Chicago, St. Paul, and up into northern Minnesota. Then we got to the eastern border of North Dakota, crossed all the way across that state with a short stop in Bismarck. And at 5:30 this morning we landed at the North Dakota-Montana border. So today we're going to go from the border, eastern border of Montana, about 400 miles, about 8 hours, halfway across Montana. We're going to end up in Bozeman. So let's board that train and get going. We start at the eastern border of eastern Montana. We come to our first stop in Montana, 25 miles from the Montana-North Dakota border, and this is the town of Glendive, which was a division point on the Northern Pacific where engines were maintained, crews were changed, and so on. We're going to follow this coal train to the west as it leaves town, and soon we come upon this bridge, which is the bridge over the Yellowstone River. And we've been following Yellowstone River for a while. This, of course, is the famed river that Lewis and Clark followed on their way through Montana. And before the arrival of the Northern Pacific, steamboats actually came down here from the Missouri River. This empties out into the Missouri just as it crosses up into North Dakota. There are two stops between here and Billings, Montana, that being Miles City, Montana, and Forsyth. Miles City was always a big trading area for cattle, and as we head west, that 150 miles to Billings, we're going to go across mostly plains area, which was where the Lakota Indians lived, and very close to the location of what's known as Custer's Last Stand. And we follow these plains where the buffaloes were. Then we come up to the Rim Rocks and the Yellowstone River just outside of Billings. Very pretty area. We start getting into the mountains here. Here's the Billings Depot. As you can see, we're leaving Billings on a train headed west. There hasn't been passenger service on this line for nearly 40 years. The last scheduled passenger service to go through here was Amtrak's North Coast Hiawatha, which succeeded the North Coast Limited after the Northern Pacific merged out of existence in 1970. This was actually a fan train organized by the Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association at one of its annual meetings back in probably the 1990s. This is the Bud Dome, the same model dome that you would have ridden in on the North Coast Limited. I don't think this particular dome has any Northern Pacific history to it, but it's the same style of dome. And here we're following the Yellowstone River. I'm guessing I took this footage about 15 to 20 years ago, and at the time I had a 4:3 camera, which was basically the shape of the old box television sets. Now we have 16:9 and a wider screen, so you may see some black bars at the sides of your screen here. Many of you know the name Warren McGee. Warren was a conductor for the Northern Pacific for many, many years. He goes back to the steam era and just died a couple of years ago. And he's probably the most famous of all the Northern Pacific Railroad's veterans. Warren was a great photographer. He's got books out on his photography, and he was also a historian, wrote many articles about the area in the Northern Pacific, and was a historian on the Bozeman, regarding the Bozeman Trail as well. And Warren worked out of the Livingston Division Point for the Northern Pacific, which is very close here. We're not too many miles from it. And this was his principal place to take photos of the Northern Pacific, and of course he got a lot of the North Coast Limited. We were lucky enough, I didn't realize it until I started looking at this footage just recently, but Warren's voice is actually on here. He was in the background as I was shooting this. I was spending all day, just about all day, hanging out the vestibule door getting scenery, and miracle of miracles, Warren McGee tells a story here about being out here in the wild country. Here you go.
And so I picked a different route and went that way, and there was and I was surrounded with rattlesnakes. And I think that was one of my great excited fishing experiences. But anyway, this is this area in here. There's an interchange here around this next corner, and there's a lot of good places to take pictures. And some of those guys that found the hills opposite the big Lombard curve, they could get over there in those hills across the river and make some nice pictures in here too.
This photo was taken by Warren McGee right in the area where we're traveling right now, and it's the North Coast Limited, our train, also traveling west with its dome cars, and the Yellowstone River right above the train. Warren lived just down the road, and this is a favorite spot for his photography. Here we are pulling into Livingston, and we're going to see one of the largest assemblies of railroad locomotives that I've ever seen in my life, especially in a small place like Livingston. Livingston was actually one of the two most important spots or maintenance facilities on the Northern Pacific between the Great Lakes and Seattle, the other one being Brainerd, Minnesota. Here they had an engine rebuilding center, and it still functions as an engine rebuilding center. There was a lot more here as well. There was quite a number of, there was the huge roundhouse and various other shop buildings. Back in the days of steam, it took a lot more to maintain these properties. And of course, there were big coal docks and watering towers and so on. Boy, more locomotives. Look at all these things. There was a train announcer, and he's going to get on here and let us know why all these locomotives are parked in Livingston. Just about all of them are in Montana Rail Link colors. Boy, they kept the engine painters busy. Look at that, two rows deep on locomotives. They're still coming up.
Montana Rail Link has fairly aggressively bought and leased a number of these old SD45s. And you'll see them sitting here, some of them in the blue paint, some of them in their former lines paint. But they like the SD45s for helper service. And of course, Livingston serves as the helper terminal for Bozeman Hill. So there's usually a couple of sets of helper engines here, waiting to push grain and coal trains up the Bozeman Hill. And then you'll see several sets of them in Helena for use on Bozeman Pass. On our left now is the depot complex in downtown Livingston. In fact, the folks that own the former Beanery Cafe here, Martin's, are going to be catering your barbecue this evening. Beanery is at this end, the main depot here in the circle of the breezeway, and the baggage room on the west end.
We're back to contemporary footage again. We can see the Livingston shops over on the left, and that area that's empty was full of maintenance buildings back in the days of steam. We're turning to the south, and that's the Livingston Depot. And the reason that such a small town had such an elaborate depot is because this was the point where tourists would come out and get off the North Coast Limited, jump another Northern Pacific train, and head south 55 miles to Yellowstone National Park, where they would board coaches and later on buses to go through the park. Here we are heading west toward the Bozeman Hill. And pretty soon we're going to see big Rocky Mountains. There they are, off to the south. The tourist train to Yellowstone ran through those mountains. All these cuts were handmade back in the day, back in the 1880s when the Northern Pacific came through here. They didn't have any power tools, so the only real power tool the Northern Pacific had was a steam-powered pile driver. So all the cuts and fills were done by shovel. You can see how hard the locomotives have to work to get the train up this hill. The only locomotive change the North Coast Limited made between Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Seattle was in Livingston. There they took 3 power units off and put 4 power units on the train so they could make it over the Rockies. And then tomorrow morning, before daybreak, the North Coast Limited encounters the Big Cascade Range out in the state of Washington, where they'll also need 4 units. It was also Livingston where the dome cars were washed. Livingston was one of the longest stops on the North Coast Limited route, 15 minutes to wash the dome cars and change out engines. Here we're about a quarter mile away from the tunnel, and soon you're going to see what looks like a herd of cattle off the left side of the train. They aren't cattle, they're buffalo. Here they are. Somebody has their own private buffalo ranch there. And in Montana, you see a lot of buffalo steaks, a lot of buffalo burgers. And here we come right up to the tunnel, and we're going to stop a moment and take a look at this place. There's a lot of good train spotting that goes on here. Here's a good look at winter conditions up in the Bozeman Pass. I grew up around here, and when I was a kid, my dad would drive a truck over Bozeman Pass 5 days a week. He'd go from Bozeman over to Livingston and back to Bozeman. And I don't think we ever really appreciated what my dad did. There was a lot of danger with big storms and icy roads and so on up here. At that time, it was just a little 2-lane paved road between the towns. We've just exited Bozeman Tunnel, heading downhill with the town of Bozeman about 12 miles away. So now those locomotives can rest a bit. The big rocky peak you see in the middle of the screen overlooks 3-mile long Rocky Canyon, and that place has special significance for me, as it was here back in 1894. My great-grandmother opened a boarding house right at this spot for coal miners who supplied the Northern Pacific locomotives with coal. We're going by way too fast. Engineer, slow this thing down. Let's go through it again. She had a 2-story building for the boarding house. There were 3 wash houses outside. There was she had a little laundry building outside. You can imagine trying to wash coal miners' clothes. Talk about the dirtiest clothes possible. She had to cook for them, had a little stable here, and so on. She lasted here 6 years with her kids with her. Her husband had died, and you can imagine what it would be like to be out here, a single woman hosting 40 coal miners. After 6 years, she decided her kids needed a better place to live, so she moved on into Bozeman. Here's a Warren McGee photo of the North Coast Limited, just about ready to arrive at Bozeman, which is about a half-mile ahead. It just came out of Rocky Canyon, which you can see there in the background, and now we're approaching the Bozeman Depot on the left. We're going to go right by it. We're going to have to go back in slow motion. One of my favorite places as a kid. This depot was built in 1892, and it's still in really good condition. You'd expect the roof to be sagging or some of the walls to be caving in, but it isn't. Out in front of the depot, extending almost the length of a passenger train, was the platform where people boarded the train. And rather than being made out of concrete, it was made out of beautiful brick, and a lot of brick. You can imagine a big platform extending the distance of a passenger train. That's been gone for years. I don't know who got it, but they really scored. This depot last saw service in 1979 when Amtrak's North Coast Hiawatha quit service. Did a stint in the movie A River Runs Through It. So if you see that movie, you'll see the Bozeman Depot. Over here in the background, that's the freight house, and there's a caboose parked beside it, and we'll take another look at that. And here's some pictures of the depot. Door to the freight room. One of the hallmarks of Northern Pacific depots was that they had knee braces along the roof eaves, and they're apparently doing their job because that's pretty steady. Here are the tracks looking to the east toward Rocky Canyon, and the trains would come around under a bridge down there, and the first thing you'd always see would be the headlight. And the freight house, somebody took and feminized it, turned it into residence. The caboose at the right is not a Northern Pacific caboose. That's a Milwaukee caboose. Northern Pacific cabooses had cupolas, and they didn't have the bay windows like that one does. Originally, I'd planned to do the entire country in one episode, maybe 20 minutes, but there's so much more to show you, so many good things, that I've decided to make it a little longer and cut it up. The next episode, we make it all the way through Montana out to the western border, and then we cross over into Idaho for a short period of time, then into the state of Washington, and up into the Cascades, which is very interesting, very pretty, and finally into Seattle. The highlight of the next issue, the second half of Montana, will probably be the crossing of the Continental Divide. It was the only place along the Northern Pacific Main Line that there were actually 2 routes, and we'll discover why and which one the North Coast Limited took. And I want to also alert you to this book, which is it's titled The Vista Dome North Coast Limited. It's by Bill Kubler, and this is a terrific book. It's a little over 300 pages with hundreds of photos, and he, like everything Bill does, he does an excellent job. So look for this. It should be on Amazon or eBay. Again, it's The Vista Dome North Coast Limited by William R. Kubler. That's who the author's name he uses. Terrific book. And I think maybe next issue, we'll take a look at some of the pages, and you can see how many photos there are and how interesting it really is. So we're going to go out with some black and white photos of what some places look like in the early days. So until I see you next time, be good and be kind to your neighbor. Here's the original North Coast Limited back in April of 1900. I'm told that this is the first day that the North Coast Limited actually ran, the inaugural operation of it. This was probably taken out in Minnesota. We saw the big shop buildings in Livingston, and this was the only point on the Northern Pacific where they would completely rebuild engines. They could do anything to a locomotive here. And steam locomotives often needed their boilers replumbed, and they'd bring them in here to Livingston to get it done. And that job would probably last about 4 years until they needed to do it again. We talked about how the North Coast Limited would drop passengers off at Livingston, and they would take a trip down south about 60 miles to Yellowstone Park. And here the train is arriving at the Gardner Station, the northern entrance to Yellowstone Park. And then passengers would get off here, and they would get on stagecoaches and go through the park. Here's a old stereoscopic slide of people getting ready to go through the park. People are fascinated by the park because they didn't have any film or video back in those days, and they had heard about the geysers, but they really wanted to see them. Also, all the hot pots they have in Yellowstone and the various animals. And we saw the big shop complex in Livingston. Here's the roundhouse that was here. I would think this photo was probably taken back in the 1940s. I believe they had almost 30 stalls here. Here's a picture of the turntable, another of the turntable. We opened this episode with some drone shots of the Glendive Bridge that crosses the Yellowstone River. This is the same bridge under construction. You can see a work train with supplies crossing it. This is the same bridge during a flood of the Yellowstone River. It looks like a lake out there, an enormous flood. Wiped out quite a bit of track and took a lot of work for the Northern Pacific to get things back in operation again. Common problem out there with all the rivers that the Northern Pacific crossed. This is the original work train, the head of the work train, back in the 1870s as it heads west, laying track. Picture was probably taken in Minnesota or the Dakotas. And following that were these dormitory cars, undoubtedly with a kitchen car there, possibly in the middle. It was noted that a lot of men didn't want to sleep in these cars because the stench of the other men was so bad. They didn't have showers and so on, especially in the winter. You just wouldn't shower. Here's a Warren McGee photo of a freight going up Bozeman Pass with the head engine just about ready to enter the tunnel. McGee was one who liked to document his photos, and this is the what's shown on the back of this particular photo. He would paste on a piece of paper, and here it notes that the head engine is making its first trip since overturning, doing an 80-mile-per-hour run on a 45-mile-per-hour curve. He usually mentions the crew on the train, the tonnage of the train, and the grade, and exactly where the photo was taken. And here's another freight taken along the Yellowstone River, and this was taken at just about the point where we heard Warren talking earlier in our program. And speaking about Warren McGee, I did get some footage of him at a NPRHA convention where we were selling photos many years ago, and we'll go out on Warren.
That's why the Reclamar was built.
Super double X or not there, I don't know.
The Reclamar was built in Germany. It was a German camera.